Before the Super Bowl rings, before the Hall of Fame speeches, before the million-dollar contracts, there are stories the NFL wishes had ended differently. Stories of players who weren't defeated by a better opponent. They were stopped by a single hit, a split-second decision, or one night that changed everything forever. Some were destined to become legends. Some were just beginning to prove they belonged. And some had already shown the world exactly how special they were before fate took everything away. Imagine if one tackle had never happened. Imagine if one car crash had been avoided. Imagine if one bullet had missed. Imagine if one injury had healed differently. How many records would have been broken? How many championships would have been won? How many lives and even NFL history itself would look completely different today? These aren't just stories about football. They're stories about dreams interrupted, families forever changed, and careers that never got the chance to become what they were meant to be. Today, we're looking back at 5 of the saddest what-if stories in NFL history. 5 players, 5 heartbreaking moments, and 5 futures that disappeared in an instant. This is the NFL's saddest chapter. These are players who never got to find out how good they could have been. Gabe Rivera. Every draft class has a what-if, but few carry the specific gravity of the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1983. The Steelers were a dynasty in transition. Terry Bradshaw was aging out. The steel curtain defense that had powered 4 Super Bowl titles in the 1970s, the Mean Joe Greens, the Jack Lamberts, was graying too. Head coach Chuck Noll needed a cornerstone, and he had a decision to make with the 21st overall pick. Sitting right there, born and raised 20 minutes from Three Rivers Stadium, was a University of Pittsburgh quarterback the whole city had watched grow up. His name was Dan Marino. Noll passed on him. Instead, Noll went back to the blueprint that built his dynasty in the first place. Take care of the defensive line first, let the offense follow. He selected a nose tackle out of Texas Tech named Gabriel Rivera. They called him Senor Sack. At 6'3", close to 280 pounds, Rivera had somehow managed to run a 8-second 4-0 yard dash as a defensive lineman video game numbers for a man that size in 1983. He'd been a consensus All-American, a wrecking ball in the Southwest Conference, a player scouts believed could anchor a defensive line for a decade. 6 picks later, Marino fell to the Miami Dolphins. We all know what happened after that. Marino would go on to throw for over 61,000 yards, make 9 Pro Bowls, and become one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game, all without a single Super Bowl ring, ironically, while wearing aqua and orange instead of black and gold. But this isn't really Dan Marino's story, this is Gabe Rivera's. Because for 6 games, Rivera looked like he might justify every bit of Noll's faith. He notched 2 sacks in his rookie season, showing flashes of the disruptive force that had terrorized college offensive lines. The Steelers believed they had their next great defensive anchor. Then came the 20th of October, 1983. Rivera, 22 years old, had been out that night. He got behind the wheel of his car while intoxicated, crossed into oncoming traffic, and collided head-on with another vehicle. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The impact threw him through the back window of his own car. He landed roughly 15 feet from the freeway. Rivera fractured his spine at the T5-T6 vertebrae. He suffered severe internal injuries to his chest and abdomen, along with significant memory loss from the trauma. When he woke up in Allegheny General Hospital, he was paralyzed from the chest down. He would never walk or play football again. He was 22 years old. He had played 6 NFL games. The Steelers of the mid-1980s never fully found their next great defensive identity. We'll never know if Gabe Rivera would have been the player who filled that void for a decade, the way Joe Green had a generation before him. What we do know is that the man who might have been Senor Sack for 10 years instead spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And here's the part of Gabe Rivera's story that too often gets left out. He didn't disappear into bitterness. He became a pillar of his hometown of San Antonio. He tutored kids through a program called Inner City Development. He worked with a non-profit called Gridiron Heroes, an organization built specifically to support high school football players who had suffered spinal cord injuries, young men living the exact nightmare he knew intimately. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2012, honoring the player he was before that October night stole the player he might have become. Years later, reflecting on the accident, Rivera admitted that every so often his mind would wander to the other timeline, the one where he never got in that car. But he said he tried not to stay there too long. He'd built a good life in the one he was actually given. Gabe Rivera passed away in 2018 at the age of 57, following complications from a perforated bowel, one more injury, decades later, still connected to the paralysis that reshaped his entire existence. What if Gabe Rivera had never gotten into that car? Would he have become the defensive superstar Pittsburgh believed he could be? Would history remember him as one of the great Steelers defenders instead of one of the franchise's greatest heartbreaks? We'll never know. Because sometimes the saddest stories in football aren't about the games that were lost. They're about the careers that never had the chance to begin. Next, Darryl Stingley. If you ask football historians to name the single moment the NFL was forced to reckon with its own brutality, most of them will point to one pre-season game on one August night in 1978. Darryl Stingley was 26 years old and entering the best years of his career. A first-round pick out of Purdue, the New England Patriots wide receiver was coming off a season where he'd caught 39 passes for 657 yards and 5 touchdowns. He was known around the league as one of the fastest, most fearless receivers in football, a guy who wasn't afraid to run routes into the most dangerous real estate on the field, the middle, where defensive backs were free to hit receivers with a violence that would be unthinkable under today's rules. And Stingley had just finished negotiating a contract extension. The deal was going to make him one of the highest-paid wide receivers in the NFL. It was supposed to be announced when the Patriots got back from their West Coast road trip. That road trip took them to Oakland for a meaningless preseason game against the Raiders. Late in the second quarter, quarterback Steve Grogan threw a pass over the middle intended for Stingley on a slant route. The ball sailed high and slightly off target. Stingley left his feet, stretching for it, fully extended, exposed. Charging toward him was Raiders free safety Jack Tatum, a man so feared for the violence of his hits that he had earned the nickname The Assassin. Tatum had been fooled by the route, recovering late, and the two men collided in an awkward, off-balance tangle. There was no flying helmet, no highlight reel launch. By most accounts, it didn't even look like the hardest hit of the game. But Stingley's helmet drove into Tatum's shoulder pad at exactly the wrong angle, compressing his spinal cord and shattering his 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae. Stingley collapsed to the turf, and he didn't move. For 10 minutes, the Patriots sideline went silent. Players took a knee. Some stared at the sky, waiting for a twitch, a raised hand, anything. Nothing came. Stingley had no feeling in his fingers, no feeling in his toes. An ambulance was called onto the field of a preseason game that, up until that moment, nobody outside of New England or Oakland would ever have remembered. Darryl Stingley would never walk again. He spent the rest of his life as a tetraplegic, eventually regaining limited use of his right arm, just enough movement to independently operate a motorized wheelchair. The contract that would have made him one of the league's highest-paid players was never signed. His career ended at 26, in the prime of his athletic life, on a play that under the rules of 1978 wasn't even a penalty. It wasn't helmet to helmet, there was no flag. The NFL took no disciplinary action against Jack Tatum whatsoever. But the league did quietly begin changing the rules that governed violent hits over the middle of the field, rules that decades later would define the modern, safety-conscious NFL we watch today. Stingley's injury is, in a very real sense, the reason defenseless receiver protections exist in professional football at all. What makes this story sadder than most is what happened, or rather, what didn't happen afterward. Jack Tatum reached out to Stingley multiple times over the years, but always seemed to do it while promoting one of his 3 separate autobiographies, each one leaning into his assassin persona. Stingley, understandably, felt like the outreach was more about book sales than genuine remorse. The two men were invited to appear together on television for the 25th anniversary of the hit. Stingley refused once he learned the title of Tatum's latest book, Final Confessions of NFL Assassin Jack Tatum. They never spoke again. And yet, this is important, Stingley said, more than once, that he had forgiven Tatum. Not for Tatum's sake, but for his own. In a 1992 interview, he explained that he'd made peace with it years earlier, even while acknowledging how much he wished Tatum had simply picked up a phone without a camera crew attached. Stingley went back to Purdue in 1992 and finished his degree through correspondence courses, walking figuratively in his wheelchair across a stage to receive his diploma 14 years after the hit that ended his career. He later worked in the Patriots front office as executive director of player personnel. He died in 2007 at age 55. From heart disease and pneumonia conditions that doctors directly linked to decades of living with quadriplegia. Jack Tatum died 3 years later, in 2010, after diabetes had already cost him parts of both legs. What if that pass had fallen incomplete? What if Darryl Stingley had walked back to the huddle like every other receiver? Would he have enjoyed several more productive seasons? Would he have become one of the Patriots' all-time great receivers? Would his name be remembered for spectacular catches instead of one tragic afternoon? No one can answer those questions. All we know is that one ordinary preseason play changed the course of football history and the course of one man's life forever. Stingley was on pace to be remembered as one of the great receivers of his generation. Instead, he's remembered as the reason the NFL had to grow up. Next, Mike Utley. 13 years after Darryl Stingley's injury forced the NFL to start rewriting its rulebook, a Detroit Lions guard named Mike Utley gave professional football one of its most enduring, most misunderstood images. Utley was 25 years old, a third-round pick out of Washington State, and by 1991, he had become the Lions' full-time starting right guard, clearing the way for a rookie sensation named Barry Sanders. Detroit was in the middle of a special season. They would finish 12-4, the franchise's best record in decades. On the 17th of November 1991, in front of a home crowd at the Pontiac Silverdome, the Lions were trailing the Los Angeles Rams 10-7 heading into the fourth quarter. On the very first play of that quarter, quarterback Eric Kramer called a pass. Utley moved to block Rams rookie David Rocker. At the last second, Rocker got a hand up, caught Utley off balance, pulled his shoulder pads down, and Utley's head snapped into the turf. He instantly became what doctors call a C567 quadriplegic. In his own words, describing it decades later, he said he'd lost feeling in his limbs before every football player has. But this was the first time he ever lost strength entirely, and it never came back. What happened next became one of the defining images in NFL history. As medical staff lifted Utley onto a stretcher and began wheeling him off the field, fully conscious but unable to move his body below the injury site, he wanted the crowd and his teammates to know something, that he could hear them. So he made a fist with one of the only parts of his body he could still control and raised his thumb. The Silverdome crowd roared, his teammates clapped. And a football tradition was born. Nearly every player who has since gone down with a serious injury on an NFL field has instinctively flashed the same thumbs up, whether they knew Utley's story or not. Detroit dedicated the rest of that season to him, wearing his number on their helmets. Offensive tackle Lomas Brown gave a tearful speech before their Thanksgiving Day game, telling Utley the entire team was playing for him now. Inspired, the Lions won that final quarter 21-10 the day of the injury, then went on a run that carried them all the way to the NFC Championship game, still, to this day, the last playoff win in franchise history. Utley never walked off a football field under his own power again. He spent 9 days in intensive care, then 10 more. He required a full-body cast built using his own linemen as physical models because doctors needed men his exact size to construct the mold correctly. Blood clots nearly killed him shortly after the injury. But Utley refused to let the injury write the rest of his story. In 1992, just months after nearly dying, he founded the Mike Utley Foundation, which has spent more than 3 decades funding research into spinal cord injury treatment and rehabilitation. He learned to ski again, He went skydiving. He scuba dives. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2016 and walked assisted, but on his feet across the stage to accept it, 25 years after doctors told him he'd never stand again. Now in his late 50s, Utley has openly discussed the physical toll of 3 decades in a wheelchair, repeated infections, surgeries to insert steel rods into his spine, complications that have only intensified with age. And yet, when asked directly whether he regrets any of it, whether he'd trade his football career to avoid this outcome, his answer has been consistent for over 30 years. No. He says football gave him more than it ever took from him. What if that play had ended like the thousands before it? What if Utley had simply stood up, walked back to the huddle, and finished the game? Could he have enjoyed another 8 or 10 years in the NFL? Could he have helped protect Barry Sanders during the greatest years of the Lions' offense? Would he have become one of Detroit's most respected offensive linemen, remembered for his blocking instead of one tragic afternoon? We'll never know. But his legacy isn't defined by what football took away. It's defined by how he chose to fight after football was gone. Next, Richard Collier. Not every story on this list involves a football field. Some of the cruelest what-ifs in NFL history happened nowhere near a stadium. Richard Collier's path to the NFL was never supposed to happen at all. He grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and poor grades kept him out of college entirely. After high school, he spent 2 years working in the produce section of a Walmart instead of on a football field. Eventually, he found his way to junior college, then transferred to Division II Valdosta State, where he helped the Blazers win a national championship. Nobody drafted him. The Jacksonville Jaguars signed him as an undrafted free agent in 2006, and against long odds, he made the 5-3 man roster as an offensive tackle. By 2008, Collier had fought his way into a bigger role. He'd made his first career start at the end of the 2007 season. That May, the Jaguars rewarded him with a contract extension, betting that the undrafted lineman who'd clawed his way onto their roster from a grocery store stockroom had a real future as a starting NFL tackle. 4 months later, that future was taken from him not by a linebacker, not by a car accident, but by a gunman. On the 2nd of September 2008, Collier and a former Jaguars teammate, Kenny Petway, were sitting in a car outside an apartment building in Jacksonville's Riverside neighborhood. Earlier that night, they'd met 2 women at a bar and followed them home. As they waited in the vehicle, someone approached from behind and opened fire. Collier was shot 14 times. He took bullets to his back, his groin, both legs, and his buttock. 1 bullet severed his spinal cord. He was placed on a ventilator and spent weeks unable to remember any details of the attack itself. Doctors would later determine that a blood clot resulting from the injuries required the amputation of his left leg above the knee. Kenny Petway, sitting inches away in the driver's seat, wasn't hit at all. Police eventually arrested a man named Tyrone Hartsfield and charged him with attempted murder. Investigators believe the shooting was retaliation. Months earlier, Collier had gotten into an altercation with Hartsfield at a nightclub and knocked him out. Prosecutors argued Hartsfield had been, in their words, hunting for a chance at revenge ever since. At trial in 2009, a friend who said he'd driven Hartsfield to the scene testified against him, describing hearing multiple gunshots and later hearing Hartsfield admit to what he'd done. The jury convicted Hartsfield of attempted first-degree murder. He was originally sentenced to life without parole. That sentence was later reduced on appeal to 27 years. Richard Collier's agent said at the time that his client faced, in his words, an extreme grief for a lifetime of dreams he would never get to fulfill. He was 26 years old. He'd finally, after years of grinding through junior college and going undrafted, secured his place as an NFL starter. And it was stripped away from him not by an opponent across the line of scrimmage, but by 14 bullets fired by a man he'd beaten up in a bar fight months earlier. What makes Collier's story remarkable isn't just the tragedy, it's what came after. In interviews years later, Collier said he had forgiven the man who shot him. He appeared in a 2010 documentary examining Jacksonville's murder rate and the city's efforts to reduce violence. using his own story as part of that larger conversation. He got married in November 2010. Nearly 6 years after the shooting, he described himself as being, in his words, on cloud nine, having rebuilt a life that no longer included football, but was, by his own account, still full and meaningful. What if he had driven somewhere else that night? What if the attack had never happened? Would he have become Jacksonville's franchise left tackle? Would he have protected quarterbacks for another decade? Would he have signed the life-changing contract every undrafted player dreams about? Instead of celebrating a long NFL career, Collier had to learn how to rebuild his entire life. Yet somehow, he refused to let bitterness consume him. He became a motivational speaker, sharing his story of perseverance and forgiveness. His football dream was taken from him, but his strength wasn't. Next, Kendrick Norton. The most recent story on this list is also one of the most physically shocking. Kendrick Norton grew up in Jacksonville and became a standout defensive tackle at the University of Miami, racking up 85 tackles, 5 sacks, and 18 tackles for loss across 3 seasons for the Hurricanes. The Carolina Panthers drafted him in the 7th round of the 2018 draft. He spent his rookie year mostly on Carolina's practice squad before the Miami Dolphins claimed him in December, bringing him back to South Florida. Heading into the summer of 2019, the 2-year-old was expected to compete seriously for a spot on Miami's 5-3 man roster, an NFL career after years of grinding on practice squads finally within reach. At around 1:18 inches the morning on the 4th of July 2019, Norton was driving his pickup truck home from a night out with his girlfriend, Kira Williams, and friends. According to the Florida Highway Patrol, Norton attempted a sudden lane change on the Dolphin Expressway near Miami International Airport, trying to reach an exit ramp. His truck made contact with another vehicle. Williams remembers Norton yelling for her to hold on as the truck spun uncontrollably before slamming into a concrete barrier and flipping onto its roof. Norton's left arm was completely severed in the crash. Williams later described the scene in devastating detail, the sight of his arm, the blood, bystanders using their own belts as makeshift tourniquets to try to stop the bleeding while they waited for an ambulance. Norton himself later admitted that in the moments before help arrived, he genuinely wasn't sure he was going to survive long enough for the ambulance to reach him. He did survive, his arm did not. Doctors performed the amputation, and Norton underwent at least 6 total surgeries during his hospitalization. Investigators later determined Norton was at fault for the crash, citing an improper lane change, though his medical costs were ultimately covered by insurance carried by both the NFL and the Dolphins. The Dolphins placed him on injured reserve for a non-football injury, and given the nature of his injuries, his playing career was immediately and permanently over. He was 22 years old. What has struck nearly everyone who has spoken to Kendrick Norton since the accident is the complete absence of self-pity in how he's approached it. He said publicly that he's never once asked why this happened to him. His girlfriend gave his residual limb an affectionate nickname, Little Ken, specifically so it would feel like a natural part of him rather than something to grieve. He's continued cooking, working out, and even driving, all one-handed, refusing to treat the loss as disqualifying from a full life. He's appeared as an honorary team captain at Dolphins games, and teammates have spoken about dedicating their play, their effort on every single snap, to a guy who physically cannot be out there with them anymore. What if that car accident had never happened? Could Kendrick Norton have developed into a dependable NFL defensive tackle? Could he have carved out a career lasting 5, 8, or even 10 seasons? Could he have become one of those late-round success stories fans love to celebrate? We'll never know. Because some careers aren't remembered for what they became. They're remembered for what they never had the chance to become. And perhaps that's the saddest what if of all. The NFL is built on unforgettable moments. Game-winning touchdowns. Impossible catches. Historic championships. But sometimes, the moments we remember most are the ones that never should have happened. When you look at these 5 stories together, one thing becomes painfully clear. None of these careers ended because they weren't good enough. They ended because life can change in a single heartbeat. These 5 men remind us that behind every helmet is a person with dreams, a family, and a future that extends far beyond football. Their careers may have ended far too soon, but their stories continue to inspire players, fans, and anyone who's ever had life change without warning. Maybe that's the real legacy they left behind. Not the stats, not the trophies, but the reminder to never take a single snap or a single day for granted. If one of these stories touched you the most, let us know in the comments. And if there's another heartbreaking NFL what if that deserves to be remembered, share it below. Your suggestion might become our next documentary. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the untold stories of the NFL. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. If this story moved you, that's exactly the point. These are the players football asks us to remember, not because of what they won, but because of what they lost and what they did anyway.